It didn't take long after the European explorers' discovery of the limestone plains for the first settlement to spring up where central Canberra sits today, near the banks of what was called the Molongou River. A parcel of land was taken up by Joshua John Mawer and called Canberry, believed to have derived from the Aboriginal Ngambri. However, Mawer didn't live here. He sent an overseer and some convict labour to get the farm started. One of those convicts was an Irishman, the highly capable but restless John Tennant.
The convict indents for him describe him as being a ploughman, a thatcher and a fencer. And this was a wonderful bunch of skills to bring to a place if you're actually going to have to start from scratch, which is what they did. Behind me is the annex for the National Museum, but what in fact stood on this site 180 years ago was 4 bark huts. And those 4 bark huts were part of Canberry Station. The river flowed at this stage not far below where those trees are. Beyond it was River Flat, which is one of the reasons that this was picked as a site. On River Flats you could grow vegetables and you could grow wheat, because these places had to be basically self-sufficient.
Tennant absconded from Canberra, was caught and put on an iron gang, absconded from that, and wound up revisiting his old home and calling on the new neighbours, this time on less friendly terms as a bushranger. Along with a partner he'd picked up called James Ricks, Tennant raided the nearby property of Robert Campbell, which was overseen by a tough Scotsman, James Ainsley. Campbell's property was called Pialago, eventually being renamed Duntroon, and is located where the Australian Defence Force Academy sits today. Tennant took whatever he could from Pialago.
The inventory of the stuff he stole from Ainsley is quite fascinating. It's subsistence crime. He steals clothing. In terms of loot, he gets, I think, 2 holy dollars and an Indian rupee. You know, it's quite ridiculous.
Tennant then threatened to burn down Canberra after discovering he'd been dobbed in by a bloke called Casey for one of his escapes.
And it was a bit like the 3 pigs, because there's this terribly fragile bark hut with a barricaded door, and Tennant outside saying, "I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house down." In this case, though, it wasn't actually blow your house down, he threatened to burn the hut down.
It was a moist and dewy evening. Tennant's fire stick proved useless in lighting the hut, which was lucky for James Cowan, Canberra's overseer, who was barricaded inside.
In the end, the other convicts, some of the convicts on the station, told Tennant that Mr. Cowan had never done him any harm and he should leave him alone. And basically, Tennant said, "Well, all right, but if anybody follows me, Englishman, Scotsman or Irishman, I'll shoot him." All of the neighbouring superintendents were determined that they were going to get rid of him because he was a menace. He was just hanging around the neighbourhood making a real nuisance of himself. So the morning after the raid on Canberra, Cowan went and got Ainsley and Duncan McFarlane from Ginninderra, and they, with an Aboriginal tracker called Make a Cake and a number of other convicts, set off after Tennant, and they chased him towards the Murrumbidgee. That would have meant almost certainly going up the Woden Valley, past Mount Taylor, and over the top towards where Waniasa and Canberra are now. This whole area was open savanna woodland, quite easy to walk across or ride across, and with reasonably good visibility from quite a distance. The Bushrangers are camped, they've got a tent up, and the party surrounds them, apparently without being seen, but something goes wrong. James Ainsley, for some reason, rushes in and single-handedly tries to arrest the Bushrangers. The rest of the party see something going on in the tent, and thinking something's gone wrong, actually fire into it. They hit Ricks, they hit Tennant, but they don't hit Ainsley, so God does look after drunks, fools and small children. They secure him, but they're still a long way from Mount Tennant, which is behind us here. What Mount Tennant may be is either a lookout from which Tennant kept an eye on the country to the north of him, or, as was long thought, it was his hideout, and it's suspected, or was suspected in the 19th century, that a lot of his loot was secreted up on the mountain, but no one could ever find it. in the end, they were both sentenced to 7 years on Norfolk Island. They went there. I'm not quite sure what happened to Ricks, but certainly Tennant served his 7 years, came back to Sydney, and although he was relatively young, he was clearly a broken man, as many people were coming back from Norfolk Island, and he died in Windsor Hospital. It's a pretty sort of tame ending to a story about a bushranger, but there you are.
So, there's apparently a buried treasure somewhere up there on the mountain?
There might be.
There might be. And what do you think could be amongst the spoils?
Well, this is it. I mean, if you were looking for Tennant's loot, if you look at the sort of stuff he stole, about the only thing that's up there that would be worth anything are 2 holy dollars that he took from James Ainsley. Now, the holy dollar is a fairly rare Australian coin, and I think those 2 of them, if they're in reasonable condition and they're still up there, they're probably worth several $100,000.
Seriously?
Seriously.
All right, well, can we do a bit of prospecting? Needless to say, we didn't have much luck.